Hi, everyone. Josh here. Since last week's episode, I have been on the road. I've had speaking events at 5 places and hope to have some sound to bring to you soon. One event was about the realities facing today's caregivers. I busted myths, especially about men, about dads. The biggest other event was about anti-Semitism and how the media lies about the history of the people of Israel, the people of Judea, also known as Jewish people. It's great to do these events because I get asked questions about the media that I have not yet covered on the show. I love getting out there and meeting listeners and finding out what they think and what their ideas are, all this great stuff. Anyways, no full episode this week, but I've been hearing from so many of you with disastrous examples of what the media is up to. Some of you are pointing out that the media is failing to provide accuracy and clarity and moral clarity about good versus evil. The media does have that ability. Here are just a couple examples. This one was from CBS. It was Bob Schieffer on the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks.
As you look in the faces of these people, you realize what a monstrous act of evil that this was, that happened to this country.
And in 2015, NBC News anchor Lester Holt talking about terrorist attacks in France.
Breaking news tonight, the face of evil behind the massacre in Paris, the manhunt for the mastermind, and terror raids across Europe for an 8th attacker who escaped after the carnage. And as the French president tells his country, we are at war, ISIS warns of an attack on American soil.
So the media can call out good versus evil. Depending on your perspective, you might think that sounds either obvious or impossible because it's subjective. But this is what's important to understand. The media operates with values, which are different from opinions. If someone walks into a classroom and pulls out a machine gun and shoots children and teachers and whoever's there, we don't say, let's find someone who thinks this is an okay thing or a good thing and get that perspective. Doing that would be crazy. Why? Because there are values. We recognize good versus evil. And sometimes the line between value and opinion can get complicated. There are times in which it gets a little confusing whether something is a value or an opinion, and that line can shift over time. But given that the media does recognize things to be evil, people are rightfully disgusted by so many news organizations refusing to apply this exact same set of values to the worst terrorist attack of our time. That is what we've been seeing in recent days. Hamas released dead bodies of these 2 beautiful children, the Bibas children, and claimed to be releasing the remains of their mother, but then didn't. And Israel, which uses, actual science, figured that out very quickly. And then ultimately, Hamas did release those remains as well. Now, this family had been taken at gunpoint during the October 7th attacks. And some people identified those attackers as quote-unquote civilians from Gaza who took advantage of the Hamas massacres to go do their own things. But also, Hamas is a movement. If people are inspired by the movement and then go do these acts of terrorism, then they kind of, in that sense, are with the movement. Either way, Hamas, in doing this release, tried to claim that this family had been killed in a bombing, in an Israeli bombing. First of all, even if that was the case, Hamas would still be responsible because when terrorists use civilians as human shields during bombings, they are responsible for the deaths of those civilians anyway. But once the remains of the children were given to Israel, it took the scientists in Israel no time at all to do their own tests. And they quickly said that these kids were slaughtered by hand. A lot of headlines say the kids died rather than they were killed or murdered by terrorists. And then in the story, these 2 claims are often treated as though they have equal legitimacy. Here's an example from broadcasting. This is NBC News.
Spokesperson for the Israeli military said that the 2 Bibas children were not killed, according to forensic examination results, in an airstrike, as Hamas had claimed. and they were not shot, but that they were killed with bare hands. So that as well is adding a lot to the distress of people following the story. Hamas has a different version. They're saying that the reason the wrong body was returned was because it was in fact an airstrike, and that therefore there was some error and overlap in the bodies that were returned. But competing narratives.
Competing narratives? No. I'm not saying that a reporter can report this one is fact and this one is a lie, unless the reporter has seen the results themselves. But do the job. Give the crucial context. Say, in Israel, there is a democratic system in which people can demand truth from their government, and Israel has some of the best scientists in the world, and scientific and medical records can be accessed by experts and double-checked and triple-checked, and this is what Israel says happened. Meanwhile, Gaza is controlled by Hamas, an evil, yes, according to what the news agency itself has said elsewhere, terrorist group that also lies all the time. This group claims that this is how this family was killed, but also keep this in mind, slaughtering Jews by hand is considered a wonderful thing among the radicalized population of Gaza. That would be an accurate report. All those things are true. Actually, here's a place in which something I just mentioned comes into play, because I did an episode on masculinity and quote-unquote toxic masculinity. Here is a little clip from that. This is the sound of a Palestinian terrorist calling his family on October 7th after massacring Jewish people. He says, "Dad, I'm calling you from the phone of a Jew. I just killed her and her husband with my own hands. I killed 10. He says, "Your son killed Jews." The father can be heard crying in pride and saying, "Oh, my son, God bless you." And his mother joins in the pride, saying how much she wishes she was there. Toxic masculinity is a driving force in Islamist terrorism. Tapping into boys' desire to feel masculine and convincing them, starting at an early age, that this is the way to do it. It is a fundamental teaching of Palestinian society in Gaza. Meanwhile, speaking of good and evil.
Good evening, everyone. We begin the readout tonight with a choice between good and evil.
Joy Reid over at MSNBC has had no problem calling out what she sees as evil. In this episode from her show in 2022, she praised Obama.
For those of us who believe in democracy and the rule of law, this should serve as a wake-up call.
Meanwhile, the Goblin King of Mar-a-Lago uses his power to amplify lies and disinformation.
If you've listened to They Stand Corrected, you might know Joy has absolutely failed to apply this to Islamist terrorist groups, instead constantly demonizing Israel and vastly downplaying the horrors of Hamas. I did a two-parter on her interview with the Queen of Jordan, during which Joy completely erased her own commitments to democracy and women's rights and everything else, just to let this wife of a monarch in an actual real-life monarchy lie on and on. As I record this, MSNBC has canceled Joy Reid's show. That could be a step in the right direction for counteracting the big lie of the left. Nevertheless, everyone, including MSNBC, should still be fighting hard against anti-democratic efforts from the right as well. Never hold back. In my travels, some people have been telling me that they feel politically homeless at this time. Not just in our political scene, really, but they say in the media as well. I reject the whole idea that there have to be two options, and that was the topic of last week's episode. If you haven't heard it, I encourage you to go back and check it out. It's about removing the political lens. We have every right to expect any agency calling itself news to report fact-checked information, to provide only truth, which is facts plus context, and to apply the exact same standards of good versus evil everywhere, consistently. That is so not too much to ask. It shouldn't even be us asking it. It should just be happening. Anyway, so much to say about this next week. I am working on next week's episode, and I'm planning to bring you some facts about immigrants that are getting lost in the media mess. In the meantime, in my latest newsletter, I explain another major failure of the media in recent days. When news agencies do report on the Bibas family, they keep appending to those reports the alleged death tolls from Gaza. These are not equivalents. A family kidnapped and slaughtered is not the same as people who are killed in bombings while terrorists use them as human shields. Those reports tossing in the alleged death tolls, which come from Hamas, are also erasing the difference between good and evil. See that in the newsletter. To support this show, please consider becoming a paid subscriber to the newsletter. To bring me to a site near you for an event, check out my website, joshlevs.com. And while I am spending hours doing all the research and preps for the next episode, maybe you could take, that same number of minutes or maybe hours and spend them all telling every human being on earth to listen to this show. Is that a reasonable request? Subscribe, rate, review, pick a favorite episode, and send personal messages to people you know saying, I really think this specific episode will speak to you. That works. As always, thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week.